Oh, and welcome everyone. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and get us started, although I know we have several people still filing in. We've got an excellent panel today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Shada Esnasheri. I am the Drinking Water Program Director at River Network. I am based in Chicago, Illinois, on the unceded traditional homelands of the Council of Three Fires, the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi tribes. I'm super excited to be here hosting and moderating this panel. And on behalf of River Network and the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition, I want to welcome you to this panel. How do we make sure water infrastructure funds go where they're most needed? I also want to give a thank you to our sponsors, the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation, the Great Lakes Fisheries Trust, the Joyce Foundation, and the Consulate of Canada in Chicago. Before we get into the panel, I know many of us are way too familiar with Zoom and housekeeping rules, but I do want to just re-emphasize to be sure to check that you are on mute while our panel are giving their presentations, and to let you know that we will have a Q&A session at the very end. So please put your questions in the chat throughout, and we'll be keeping track of them and make sure we put them to our panelists. So I just wanted to frame up the discussion for today on infrastructure. It seems like anyone and everyone is talking about infrastructure right now in one way or another, and specifically the influx of funding that will hopefully soon be flowing from the federal level. We also know that investment in water infrastructure in particular has steeply declined since the 1970s. So many see this renewed focus as a real opportunity to support states and local communities in investing in their water and the objective of delivering safe and affordable water for all residents. However, we also know that the distribution of water infrastructure funding has long needed improvement, and instead of addressing inequities, it can often exacerbate them by not flowing to communities most in need of investment and repair. Specifically, communities that have historically borne the disproportionate burden of pollution need increased funding to improve their water systems and keep their residents safe. So this panel will address how water policy and funding can reach and benefit these very communities that have experienced historic barriers to access and have been disproportionately impacted by disinvestment. So we are super fortunate today to have a wonderful panel, as I mentioned, working at the local, state, and federal level, bringing their perspectives to this conversation. So today we'll be hearing from Shaquana McIntyre, who is CEO of Family Rise Together in Duluth, Minnesota. We've got Nick Leonard, Executive Director of the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center. And then finally, Elizabeth Caesar, Senior Advisor for EPA's Office of Water. So like I said, I'm sure to be a great conversation, very informative. And we're going to start with a presentation from Shaquana.
Good morning, everyone. As you have heard, my name is Shaquana McIntyre. I am the current CEO of Family Rise Together, which is a nonprofit organization that I started here in Duluth, Minnesota, serving both North and South St. Louis County. I am going to share my screen. Can you guys see the PowerPoint? Perfect. Okay, so a part of my work, I was contracted with Andrew Slade from the MEP organization here in Duluth, Minnesota. And my job as a facilitator, as a contractor, was to go out into our community and begin asking the hard questions. And really the hard questions boil down to why is money and contracts and subcontracts and employment opportunities not being offered in the BIPOC community in Duluth, Minnesota. In Duluth, Minnesota, we have about 2,500 individuals who identify as Black, and we have about 3,300 individuals who identify as multicultural, which means that we have a very large group of diversity, and yet we are 24% of our diverse population is underemployed. And so I began this process by going into our community and having focus group discussions. And we started with one of the largest in-person discussions or in-person events, Juneteenth here in Duluth, which was hosted by Duluth and Superior. And during that time, we asked questions for the group, and those questions really dwell down to who is the water infrastructure, who is MEP, and why do we care about this place? Like our community and the environmental world, depending on who their family is and where they are from, they're not necessarily looking for these types of jobs. And what I learned most is that it's the language. There's a language barrier in between the jobs as well as the employers and the contractors who are putting out these jobs and getting it into the community where it looks interesting enough to where they want to apply, where they feel like they're adequate enough to even apply, even if it is training on the job. So some of the things that we took away from what I took away from that 2-hour conversation is, how am I supposed to know what I don't know? Meaning, how do I research this stuff if I don't even know who they are or where to find them or what language that they're using? They thought, people have shared, I never thought about getting contracts with the Fed. So a part of Family Rise Together work in our community is providing technical assistance to individuals who are starting a business. So I went in under the pretense of, yes, we want to help get jobs, but also opening up the door to have conversations about becoming a subcontractor for prime contractors in our community. The goal is to close the wealth gap in our community. And I don't know how much you all know about the wealth gap for the BIPOC community, but the BIPOC community, the Black community, directly is 10 times less. Our wealth is 10 times less than what our counterparts is across the country. And so then it was like, okay, what is Duluth Great Lakes Environmental Restoration recreation? Like, they're like, what is this? Who are they? And why does this matter in my community? And it was about teaching them, like, they give us the water to drink so we don't have to buy bottled water, right? Like bringing it down to the basics of basics so that they can connect to it. Without being able to connect to it, then there was no reason for them to even dig into it and understand that this is a part of our survival, right? In our community, a lot of our community members are in survival mode, which means that Duluth has a very high transient community of individuals moving from different communities that are high population of poverty, underemployment, and no employment at all, low educational graduation rates. And so those are the individuals we're coming in contact with here in Duluth, and we're saying, how can we make it better for them and make it better for our community? Because as we know, if a group of people or a family is suffering, that means the entire community is suffering, because the weight of caring for those individuals fall on the entire community. Other individuals share, where would I even look for a job application for them? And working for the feds would require I have disposable income before I receive reimbursement. And that is the white supremacy process, keeping Black and brown folks from participating in wealth building opportunities. The individual who shared that statement was I asked permission to share that statement, and it was very clear that they did not want their quote to be changed. So this is a verbatim quote. And then they went into a 20-minute discussion about how the system that we are utilizing in our country is set up to create and keep Black and brown families having to deal with the wealth gap, right? So in order to actually close the wealth gap, we have to be more intentional about looking at employment and entrepreneurship, because employment does not bring wealth. What it does is it keeps you in survival mode. And then I'll keep going. Some of the barriers that Black-owned businesses are struggling with is starting businesses but unable to hire due to little to no financial capital. Only 7% of Black-owned business employer firms have 6 to 10 employees compared to a national average of 12%. And Black business owners receive less business financing less often and at higher rates. Again, as I shared, Family Rise Together is in the business of helping individuals start businesses. And what I can say is that in Duluth, currently first of all, we don't have a Black business district at all. There's very little presence for Black businesses. And absolutely little to no one who is available and ready to take on subcontracting jobs or subcontracting opportunities. And so a part of that conversation was also a statement that someone shared, and they were like, because of the pandemic, I would rather have liberty than death. That hit me the strongest because individuals in the BIPOC community is saying, I refuse to go back to a job that continues to have me working and feeling like a slave, and I'm barely able to make ends meet, and I'm killing myself to get there and figure out how to keep taking care of my families. And so they shared liberty or death. And so the pandemic forced families to figure out how to live with less than they had when they already had nothing. And so we can no longer assume employment is connected to the need to survive for the BIPOC community, which is why being very clear that entrepreneurship is not only an option, it could be the only option if we are not changing systems and holding employers.
You want to book it? Is that what you mean?
For holding people accountable, employers accountable for providing an equitable workspace, right? We are, as employers, we're often worried about our customers feeling safe, and we're not putting enough energy into ensuring that the space is safe for those who are working for us as well. Recommendations: uncheck the box for those who've been incarcerated. BIPOC community has a very high rate of individuals who have previously been incarcerated, and that box on application makes it very hard for individuals who have been incarcerated and who are returning home to actually get jobs. So one of my recommendations is remove the box from the application. Develop and strengthen existing transitional employment, meaning there are transferable skills that individuals have, and we are not doing enough in the BIPOC community to look at their transferable skills to get them in positions of livable wage jobs. We need to eliminate barriers to participate in training, and those barriers look like transportation. It looks like education. It looks like a mentor. A variety of barriers. So we need to remove those barriers, and then we need to ensure more adults access training for in-demand livable wage careers by expanding career paths and training options. Currently, the community is learning more about the workforce center in our community, but we're not utilizing them to their fullest capacity. So there's opportunity for partnerships to actually get more training in place for the BIPOC community. I don't believe in recreating the wheel. And so if there's opportunity for utilizing systems that are already in place and merely tweaking the environment, and those we are hiring as the face of the organization can often open up the door for more BIPOC community members to walk through the door and utilize those services and actually get livable wage jobs. We need to begin educating our children in elementary school. Ultimately, if we are thinking about those who are living in poverty communities, that are living in survival mode, these are not jobs that they're often teaching their children about. So if we're able to go into the school and start educating them early about these positions and these jobs and these industries, we're more likely to have children ready to graduate and step into these fields at an early age. And lastly, but not least, employers should be held financially responsible for not addressing the inequalities in their agencies within their business. And so what I mean by that and where that came from is throughout this work, I tried to reach out to prime contractors to have a conversation about their diversity policy, their hiring policy, and how they're engaging with the BIPOC communities. And honestly, I got little to no feedback or return call. So there was no respect in the need to get access to this information to even provide proper recommendations. And they could be doing a really great job, but I would have no idea because they had no desire to speak with me and work with me. And that is my presentation. Are there any questions? Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Shaquana, for that presentation. We're going to move next to Nick Leonard, and I do ask that you all go ahead and put your questions in the chat or save them for the end. We will have a question and answer session for all panelists. So.
Great, thank you. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about state revolving funds in the state, specifically the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program, and how to get engaged at those programs at your state level. And this is something that we at the Great Lakes Environmental Law Center really got engaged in 2019 when we were thinking about ways that we could address water affordability concerns in a more sort of concrete way than policy advocacy, which we had been doing for quite some time. And so one of the ways that we identified at the time was trying to get involved in sort of these revolving loan fund programs and specifically submitting public comments to the Michigan Department, at that time, Michigan Department of Environmental Quality. And what we learned at the time was that there were some serious issues with how Michigan was both engaging the public and administering their programs. And there were some sort of serious gaps that we thought existed that meant it wasn't fully addressing the priorities that we had, which is helping to address the growing water affordability crisis in Michigan. And so I'm going to talk through just some of the lessons that we learned and some of the tools that you all can use to get engaged with your states around these programs. So first, I think it's important to start with just sort of context setting for how these programs are addressing the need. And, basically, I think we all know that there's a very large gap in sort of the amount of investment that we need to be making in our drinking water and wastewater infrastructure and the amount that we're actually investing. And that's what these two graphs are basically meant to show, that the EPA has estimated that we need to be investing $23.6 billion per year over the next 20 years in drinking water infrastructure. Our SRF program, or the Clean Drinking Water SRF program, is putting in $1.12 billion. So significantly less than we need. And same story on the wastewater infrastructure side. We need $13.5 billion per year, and our SRF program is bringing in 1.64. Obviously, I think the hope is that soon these numbers will change and there will be a dramatic increase in infrastructure investment. But that's where we are right now. And just to give you an idea of sort of where money's coming from, especially for drinking water needs, this is an idea of just where the needs are, and it's mostly in our distribution and transmission systems. And then this gives you an idea of where the money is coming from to meet those needs. And you'll notice it's a lot of private borrowing, a lot of current revenues. Small 7% chunk is being met by the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program. So to date, that's unfortunately played a relatively small role in funding the capital investments needed in drinking water systems, but I think there's, like I mentioned, real hope that that's going to change sometime soon. I wanted to provide a real basic overview, and I'm not going to get into too much detail on this, but just sort of the mechanics of the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Fund programs. And so I'll start by mentioning that the Clean Water State Revolving Fund Program is to fund wastewater infrastructure. It's established under the Clean Water Act. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund Program is to address drinking water infrastructure needs. It's established under the Safe Drinking Water Act. They function in fairly similar ways. And basically, the EPA will provide an annual capitalization grant to states based on their need. And states are then required to provide a 20% match of that grant. So basically every year, a little bit of money is coming in from the federal government. Every year, the state is putting in a little bit of money to fund these revolving loan fund programs. And then basically the state describes how it's going to administer its fund in an annual intended use plan. Now that's generally published every year by different states, and as we'll talk about, it's one of the key ways to get involved. But it basically outlines, really important things like interest rates, who qualifies for sort of additional subsidies in terms of disadvantaged communities, and also describe scoring criteria for programs. So it's a really key document, a really key place for the public to get involved. From there, the state then receives applications for funding based on local wastewater and drinking water from local wastewater and drinking water utilities. And they'll score applications based on the unique scoring criteria that state has created. And then they'll disperse funds generally through low interest loans, but also through additional subsidies such as principal forgiveness. One thing to really highlight here, if there's one takeaway, is that there's a lot of flexibility for states in their clean water and drinking water revolving fund programs. And so there's some basic requirements described in both the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, but states enjoy a lot of flexibility in terms of setting interest rates, defining who is and is not a disadvantaged community, and therefore who's eligible for additional subsidies, and scoring criteria for projects. And so there's a lot of flexibility, and that means a lot of room for advocates to get involved. So I want to walk through some of the things that have been of interest to us when we've been looking at, in particular, Michigan's state revolving fund program. And when we really started working on this in 2019, what we were curious about is what other states were doing, and whether Michigan was sort of an outlier or whether they were sort of par for the course. And so we started to look at interest rates. And here's sort of a set of different sort of interest rate structures from across the Great Lakes states, and this might be a bit outdated. This analysis hasn't been updated in the past year. For example, I know Michigan has recently changed its interest rate structure just a bit, but it should give you the basic framework. And what you'll notice is that most interest rates are based on existing bond or market rates and provide a little bit below that, based on some percentage. Most will provide some, discount or a lower interest rate based on either economic factors or the size of the system or both. Michigan is a bit of an outlier here, is what we found, because it, especially when we were working on this in 2019, simply provided a 2% flat rate. That was it, and no adjustments for population size, no adjustments for economic factors. You'll see some states will go as low as, such as Pennsylvania, 1%, which has a really unique structure of sort of a sliding scale based on unemployment rate, the state unemployment rate compared to the county unemployment rate. Michigan since adjusted their rate. I think their base rate is now, or their rate for sort of hardship disadvantaged communities is 1.875. So slight adjustments, but this just gives you an idea that there's a lot of variability even in something as essential as just interest rates for these programs. There's also a significant amount of variability in terms of disadvantaged community definitions. Now, why is a disadvantaged community definition important? It's largely because it's a way to determine who's eligible for the additional subsidy under the SRF program that's commonly referred to as principal forgiveness. So disadvantaged communities are eligible for principal forgiveness, which functionally turns their loan into a grant, and so they can be eligible for principal forgiveness within a year, for example, of getting their loan. And so it's a really important definition. It's one that we were paying close attention to in Michigan. We wanted it to be appropriately scaled, so not over inclusive, but of communities that we didn't think needed the additional subsidy based on the demographics of their community, but also was bringing in communities that were facing real affordability pressures. And once again, a lot of variability, but you'll notice the common thread here. All of the states that we looked at used median household income as sort of a starting point metric for them, or involved it in some way. We didn't really support that notion when we talked to Michigan about these issues, because we know that median household income in particular can miss a lot of the lower income folks, and just doesn't provide as fine of an analysis as we would like. but it's pretty ubiquitous in these definitions. One other thing that's important to note, I put sort of the sources of each definition next to the state. Most are defined in the intended use plan themselves, which is important because that definition can come up for public comment on an annual basis as that intended use plan comes out on an annual basis. Ohio defines it in regulation. Michigan defines it in statute, which has made it very difficult to change because any change in the definition of what is and is not a disadvantaged community requires a legislative act. One thing that I'll highlight from our comments when we were initially looking at Michigan's intended use plan and its definition of disadvantaged community is that we were and remain concerned that Michigan's definition was over-inclusive, meaning communities that we didn't think should be included in as a disadvantaged community were. And one example is we did an analysis basically looking at the ratio of households in a community that were above 200% of the federal poverty level to those below 200% of the federal poverty level, and found that the definition as Michigan had it allowed not only communities like Benton Harbor to qualify, which has a ratio of 2.6 households below the federal poverty level to every one above, but it also allowed communities like Lake Orion to qualify for disadvantaged community status, which is if they have one household below 200% of the federal poverty level for every 8 above it. And so, oftentimes you need to sort of do a finer analysis to try to figure out, whether or not state is really targeting disadvantaged community subsidies to the appropriate places. And, what we found in Michigan was that it wasn't, and it sort of in some ways spurred conversations to try to amend that definition, but unfortunately that takes a long time through legislation. The other thing that we were really curious about in terms of SRF programs was how different states placed an emphasis on certain projects. So one of the things that we originally looked at was how different states were using their state revolving fund, their drinking water state revolving fund, to prioritize lead service line replacements. And there were really a number of different strategies that we found. I think these were 3 of the most interesting. New York provided additional points in the scoring criteria for projects that addressed copper and lead corrosion, pretty basic. Ohio provided a 0% interest rate for projects that involve total lead service line replacement. I thought that was a fairly strong prioritization technique. And then Wisconsin allowed any project involving water main replacement must also include complete removal of lead service line components from the water main to the meter. And so, once again, there's a lot of flexibility in these intended use plans. There's a lot of flexibility as to how, not only how states administer their funds, but then how they prioritize certain projects over others by sort of doing unique things with their scoring criteria, giving 0% interest rate to some projects, having a certain condition for other projects like Wisconsin did. So something to keep in mind as you're sort of getting engaged on this issue. So how to get involved? And the most basic way is to get involved in the intended use plan, both under the drinking water state revolving fund program and the clean water state revolving fund program. So once again, those are released annually by state environmental departments and will go out for public notice and comment. The public notice and comment procedures vary widely from state to state, and states are not typically very good about broadcasting the notice very, very broadly. And it's even unpredictable from states from year to year. Like Michigan has had their public hearings sometimes in July, sometimes in August, sometimes in September. It varies based on the year. And so, basically the legal standard here is states have to provide for meaningful public input, but it doesn't set a specific date. And so you kind of have to just keep an eye on things and communicate with your environmental department early to know sort of what they're up to, when things will be ready, things like that. Because you'll notice even some states like Indiana, they'll give you essentially 2 weeks for public notice and comment. And for those of you that are familiar with public notice and comment procedures, 2 weeks is a very short timeline. Like even 30 days is a short timeline. And so, you know, in a place like Indiana, you'd have to be really on top of things to, you know, be able to have input. And so, you know, another challenge that we've run into in getting involved in intended use plans is commonly it hasn't been an area where there's been a lot of advocacy, and like, you know, there's very few public comments that have traditionally gone into these public hearings or these public comment periods. Remember when we first got involved in 2019, we were basically told that we were the only commenter in that, you know, our comment was received too late to be meaningfully incorporated into that year's intended use plan. And that, you know, we had raised some good points, but, you know, it's just too late in the game to get involved. And, you know, which was a surprise to me because our comment was in by the commenting deadline. But so I think it's a place where advocates can have a large impact because it's a place where advocates haven't really spent much time before. And so, but there will be some growing pains in a lot of these states, given sort of that a lot of these public processes are here as, you know, essentially window dressing, and because they're required, not necessarily always to facilitate feedback in the best way. But the good news is that when we first started working on this in 2019, our comments were too late for the 2020 intended use plan, but some of the changes that we recommended were incorporated in the 2021 intended use plan. So it just took an extra year. But certainly I think it's a place that is going to be of growing importance for, you know, infrastructure advocates, for drinking water affordability advocates, for clean water advocates, you know, given the likely increase in federal funding. And so it's a place where you can have success and you can have input. And, you know, I'm happy to sort of talk more about our experience in Michigan for anybody that might be interested.
Thank you, Nick. A few things of note. I just want to share logistically, if you'd like to share your questions in the chat for the end, or we will be taking questions if you want to come off of mute and use the raise hand function. So I just wanted to flag that for folks who didn't see it. And I believe we will be making materials available as well as the recording of this for participants. So next, I would like to turn it over to Elizabeth Caesar to talk about her work.
Thanks, Shada. Greetings, everyone. I am coming to you from Washington, D.C., which is actually the home of dozens of tribal nations, as many of you may know, including the Piscataway, the Pamunkey, the Nantego or Nanticoke people, the Mattaponi, and the Monacan. It's just such a pleasure to be here. I'm Elizabeth Caesar, and as many of you know, my heart is very much belongs in the Great Lakes region. While I'm currently on a detail serving as a senior advisor to EPA's Assistant Administrator for Water Radical Fox, I'm also the co-director of the Environment Program at the Joyce Foundation. It's great to be here with you, and I can't wait for the next HAL convening, which I hope will be in person. I miss you guys. As we all know, the Great Lakes region has unique challenges, but also unique opportunities when it comes to overcoming the systemic racism that's resulted in zip codes being predictors of the quality of your water service. Administrator Regan and Assistant Administrator Fox have a bold vision about how to address these problems, from climate impacts to lead to polluted water. And now really is water's moment in many ways to be a solution for advancing equity, making environmental progress, and improving economic vitality. We're doing a lot of urgent and essential work at EPA, but today I'd like to cover the ways we're elevating investments in communities that are dealing with compounding environmental burdens. First, I'd like to talk a lot about the proposed funding for water infrastructure that we're seeing with the bipartisan infrastructure bill that's working its way through Congress. The funding, as Nick mentioned, is historic. It's the single largest investment in our nation's water infrastructure, with nearly $50 billion allocated to EPA in the current version of the bill. And the legislation really is urgent, as you've heard, and well, America's water utility systems are aging and in need of upgrades to become more resilient, especially in the face of increased stress from climate change. We know the problem is further exacerbated in environmental justice communities that have been for too long left behind without investment or meaningful seat at the table. And the Great Lakes region is no stranger to the economic, environmental, and public health challenges created by aging infrastructure. With this legislation, I want to point out that the funding will flow through existing infrastructure programs, with most of it going through the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds and the Clean Water State Revolving Loan Funds. That means we will all have a role to play in ensuring those funds reach the communities that need it most. The legislation will also provide funding specifically to support EPA in elevating communities disproportionately exposed to lead in drinking water and to PFAS. EPA's infrastructure investment programs, including the WIN Act grants, WIFIA loans, and SRF, have shown us that these funds have the power to provide infrastructure support that can uplift communities, but it has to be intentionally directed and considered. And I can't talk about the infrastructure bill without a huge thank you to the Howe Coalition for your work to make sure that it included $1 billion to support the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. And I think there's work that we can do together to help shape the future of GLRI so that its benefits reach even more broadly than they do today. Assistant Administrator Fox has been pretty eloquent, I think, in her leadership about the about the transformative impacts of infrastructure investment. These investments are truly one of the best bets we can make to bring a multitude of benefit to communities. So now that we have this huge potential opportunity to support communities like never before with the bipartisan infrastructure bill, EPA is strongly considering how to make sure we elevate low-income communities and environmental justice communities that could most benefit from these dollars. Administrator Regan is leading the agency to embed equity in everything we do, from funding to policy. And at EPA, equity means three things in the context of water. One, first, everyone must have access to clean, safe drinking water service. Second, investments in water infrastructure need to be equitably distributed. And third, we must make decisions informed by the lived experiences of the communities we serve, especially those hurt first and worst by stresses on water resources. One of the most exciting initiatives we're pursuing to center equity in our work is through Justice 40. This initiative spans the entire federal family with the goal of delivering at least 40% of the overall benefits from federal investments in climate and clean energy to disadvantaged communities. The Office of Water will implement programs with the Clean Water SRF, the Drinking Water SRF, and the WIN Act grants to align the goals set forth in Justice 40 with those programs. As you know, the state revolving loan funds are a collaboration between EPA and the states. So we're planning how we'll work with the states to make sure those funds go where they're needed most. And as Nick mentioned, one of the key parts of that is these intended use plans. EPA is developing guidance to states and to the regions who review intended use plans about what our expectations are related to the distribution of those funds, particularly to disadvantaged communities or those who have long-standing infrastructure needs that simply have never been served before. And as more guidance is provided about Justice 40, we'll also be broadly applying those principles to other EPA programs. This year, for the first time, our WIFIA loan program included equity as a priority for selecting communities to apply for low interest loans. We're also using the agency's discretion to lower match requirements when we can for loans to disadvantaged communities. In addition, we're also aligning our non-point source Section 319 program to fit these goals. The program, which as many of you know, protects and restores water impacted by non-point source pollution, is newly committed to ensuring those benefits reach disadvantaged communities. We're also encouraging states to prioritize projects in disadvantaged communities to build capacity and provide match waivers when needed so that those dollars flow to the places that need the funding the most. As many of you know, most communities in the Great Lakes region are experiencing the impacts of climate most profoundly through water, flooding, drought, water quality impairments. Our work to invest in disadvantaged communities is underscored by the fact that climate change and the legacy of disinvestment in infrastructure in communities of color creates compounding effects. As we know, climate change really is a force multiplier for systemic racism. So while we're working to fortify natural and physical infrastructure for long-term resilience, we're also crafting durable policy with equity embedded in it. EPA is currently conducting outreach with our state, local, and tribal partners about revisions to the financial capability assessment. The financial capability assessment guidance outlines the financial information and formulas the agency uses to assess a community's financial resources that are available to implement pollution control measures. This guidance is being revised to more fully consider the impacts to low-income communities by proposing additional metrics to understand the severity and prevalence of poverty using the lowest quintile income in a community to better understand both the depth of poverty and the prevalence of poverty. And we're also making clear EPA's expectation that communities seeking flexibility in compliance schedules must demonstrate their efforts to ensure that water services remain affordable to their lowest income customers. The revised guidance also makes clear that people in lower income communities should not have second-class access to clean water. As necessary, EPA will revise, rescind, or write policy and funding programs that center equity so that EPA can truly meet its mission of protecting public health and the environment for everybody. Water has always fueled progress and prosperity in the Great Lakes region. It's just an inextricable part of our identity. And at EPA, we're working for a future where clean water in your tap, in your neighborhood, and in our lakes is an everyday experience for everybody. We know that partnerships with HOW and local communities across the region are a critical part of that vision. There are many programs and policies we're pursuing that center equity, but today I just wanted to review the ones most closely related to infrastructure. And I just wanted to emphasize Nick's point about these intended use plans. I think there's a real opportunity in the Great Lakes region for advocates to focus on those plans. And one of the things being inside EPA is, the notice and comment period that the states may close, but you can always send those to Region 5, to the Water Division directors, your comments about concerns with intended use plans, so that as the regions review those plans, they have that information in hand. If you want to pursue that strategy, I'd like to talk a little bit more about suggestions about how you might do that, but I want to stop now and get to other questions. Shada, back to you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you to all of our presenters. And I'm going to follow on that point that you were just making, Elizabeth. I'm wondering if both you and Nick could speak more to the intended use plans. And obviously there are some flaws with it, with the comment period closing after the fact where it's actually able to be incorporated into the next year's intended use plan. So just thinking about, I know a lot of folks are a bit new to this and maybe they're familiar with IUPs, but haven't had experience in exploring and providing feedback on them. So just wondering if either of you could provide some recommendations for us about how to get started on that process and how to engage, whether it's Region 5 or your state, on IUPs and the sorts of things to look out for.
I think what to look out for is going to vary based on what your priorities are. I mean, for us, our priorities were sort of drinking water affordability and trying to just maximize the SRF dollars that were going to disadvantaged communities. And so that's why we were looking at things like interest rates, disadvantaged community definition, things like that. Now, I know some people are really advocating really hard for, more green infrastructure investment from the clean water SRF. And so, that's, I think, related, but, a slightly different tack. So it'll just vary. And so, but either way, what you're looking for should be in the intended use plan. And so I think there are a number of different ways to advocate for it. Like you can go through sort of the scoring criteria. And this is where I think the slide that I had on how different states are prioritizing lead service line replacements, because that was another priority of our organization. And, there's just a bunch of unique ways. And so you can find previous states' intended use plans from previous years pretty easily and just sort of do some research. Because I think what's most effective that we found in advocating to states regarding their intended use plans is, what other states are doing and showing your state how other states are being more creative to sort of further the things that you're really interested in.
And I guess so following on that and recognizing that there are real limitations at the federal level, there's a question from Andrew Slade about, specifically directed toward Nick, is there a way for the SRF to have strings attached regarding environmental justice issues for states, like around hiring for projects? So again, thinking about the work that Shaquana's been doing around workforce development.
Yeah, there are ways for that to happen, but it mostly happens at the state level. And so it's mostly a matter of advocating for sort of states to include, things in their scoring criteria or stuff like that to sort of emphasize, different points.
I guess I'd like to invite Shaquana, if you want to chime in about your experience with getting involved and directing some of these funds toward workforce development, if you have any insights or feedback there.
Yes, I do believe that there should be more money for technical assistance. There should be more money for training. There should be more money to and I don't want to get on a soapbox, but this is where I get like really passionate. So my experience with this work was exciting, but frustrating. And it was frustrating because it is time and time again within our community, we get the information last. Right? We get the information based on when organizations need to meet their deadline of something that should have been done and should be being done throughout the entire time of a grant period, considering that's what this money is supposed to be for, is utilizing it to serve BIPOC and help BIPOC community members in some sector. It also means that we need to change the definition of community engagement. When we think about community engagement, we think there's a problem, community agencies recognize it, the state recognizes it, the feds recognize it, community is living in it. They've been having these conversations for decades and generations. And so when agencies, state and feds figure it out, then we want to go into the community and we want to have conversations with people. We provide them food, daycare, a gift card, and transportation, because those are barriers for meeting our needs as an agency to get the questions and answers that we need. But what that also means is that we are going into these communities and we're taking their intellectual property, going back, writing grants, getting funding to hire someone to go back into where we got the solutions from in the first place. It's theft of intellectual property. It's a slap in the face, and it continues to say that there is no power within the community for which we are serving. And so a part of this funding process is we need to be changing the language and the expectations of what community engagement looks like in order to get people to the table and keep them at the table.
Thank you for that, Shaquana. I see another question coming in through the chat, but I also wanted to make space for Ayana, who wanted to come off of mute. Ayana, if you still have a question.
Yeah, thanks, Shada. I had a question for the previous speaker when he was saying that, to make changes to SRF like definitions of disadvantage, he said that would require legislative action. But I was wondering, like, are there other ways of going about that? Like in Illinois, we've been talking with the Illinois EPA, and we had conversations about making adjustments to like what is considered a disadvantaged community, because as folks probably saw in like the slides he put up, that money is mostly going towards like predominantly rural and white communities, just because of, if it's 25,000 people or less and you're making low income, that doesn't apply to Chicago or Kankakee or other cities that need it. But anyways, my main question was just, I know that he had said, it requires legislative action, but have there been examples of in other states where people have been able to do that administratively?
Definitely. So Michigan is unique in that respect. Michigan is the only state that we surveyed that defines disadvantaged communities for these programs via statute, which then requires, any changes to be done through legislation. Other states, and Illinois included, the common way that it's defined is in their intended use plan. And so what that means is basically just, advocating for your state to just change what that definition is and its intended use plan, and you'll have an opportunity to do that on an annual basis.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the next question I'm seeing is an interesting one. So given that the boundaries of community water systems do not always precisely map onto municipal boundaries, is there a need or opportunity for better reporting requirements or data collection by states to make sure we have a clear picture of whether funding is going where it's needed and the impact it's having? So kind of this disconnect between community water systems and municipal boundaries and whether or not that's impacting the flow of funds and how we're defining disadvantaged communities, I think. I don't know exactly. I'm thinking, Nick, that's to you, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think, there's a lot of reporting that goes into sort of SRF programs and where the money is going and things like that. And I don't think we have a very clear picture on the impact it's having. And so, but every year I should mention that states will also be required to publish a project priority list that describes sort of where these projects are, where applications for these funds are, and what the project is and how they were scored. So there is that basic level of transparency, and so that's another thing to sort of look for. I mean, it's not incredibly helpful. It's typically like a spreadsheet, so it can be hard to just sort of visualize the data. That's how I would put it. But there's at least that layer of transparency, that's out there. But I don't think there's been much work to sort of analyze it through sort of like a racial equity lens or something of that nature.
Thank you, Nick. And I do know that Elizabeth is going to have to hop off a little bit early as duty calls. So if there are any additional questions for her, please feel free to ask them now. Otherwise, I was going to turn, sure, Shaquana, I see your hand raised. I was actually going to ask you a question.
No, sorry, I didn't want to ask a question for Elizabeth. I know that's where you're ending. I wanted to ask a question to Nick. So my question is, with all of the changes that are occurring with the procurement office and how the procurement office across the state are able to serve community, which is where as an organization that does technical assistance, where will that technical assistance that the procurement offices were able to provide for individuals that are trying to get contracts with the feds, where is that new funding or opportunity going to be placed for new organizations to get access to this money to do more of this work? Because what I find to be a continued struggle is it seems like people are just naturally grandfathered in, right? If they've been getting the contracts for years on years, that seems to continue at the state level, the Fed level, and at the local level. So what is the state and the Fed level doing to ensure new faces, new bodies, and Black and Brown led organizations are getting opportunity and access to this money?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, one that we haven't worked a ton on. We've mostly worked on sort of the nuts and bolts of the program, but I think, and are you talking about private contractors to do the work? Is that sort of where your mind's at?
Private contractors, all of it. The reality is that Black and Brown led organizations are not being represented at the rate that it should be. So wherever we're needed, how do we get there?
Yeah, I mean, I know, so this is sort of related, maybe a bit tangential to your question. One of the problems I know has been sort of the complexity of applying for SRF dollars. In Michigan, when we first started to work on this, Michigan wasn't even receiving enough applications to get all of their money out the door. And so just because the process of applying was procedurally burdensome. And in particular, I've heard sort of anecdotes of predominantly Black communities having a particularly hard time navigating the process because they typically lack, the resources and the familiarity with the program to access it. And so, I don't have any great answers for you off the top of my head, but I would imagine it's a matter of sort of familiarity with sort of the bureaucratic agencies involved with overseeing the program and their outreach to other programs. One of the things to keep an eye on is there's typically an application deadline for these funding programs, and it's, summer to spring is generally when it is, and it'll generally be published every year on the state's website. And so something to keep an eye out for, and just communicating with state agencies about.
Thank you, Nick.
Shada, can I ask? Well, it seems to me that, like a lot of the potential groups that are being most impacted, frontline community groups, there's a lot going on. They're trying to protect their neighbors, their family, their friends, and to have to weigh in on intended use plans every year it seems like a privilege, right? For those that have the time to do so. And so I hear Elizabeth in that, they can only provide guidance. It just feels like a congressional fix, although that's a heavy lift all in itself, I'm well aware of that, is like the best route to go. But I don't know that there's not an impact that I'm missing in a potential outside of the Great Lakes states. Because, honestly, I've talked to a lot of states across the nation, and I don't think anyone's really figured out how to make sure that neighborhoods in large communities or large cities are getting the resources they need, and that a lot of times it does go to smaller communities. And so I guess I'm just trying to think through, that privilege and burnout and resource, and how do we make the biggest impact? I don't know if that's a question in there, but it's just a thought.
So what I heard in there is we need more community navigators. So I'm a social worker by trade. My education is in social work. And the reality is that the gap is the person, like we have our state and our feds, and then we have community and organizations, and there's the gap, and what could close that gap is a bridge, right? We can't force the feds to change. We can't force the state to change. I mean, we can fight for it, but we can either like figure that out, or we can say, look, you guys aren't going to change, and we know that you're not going to change. So here's what we need. We need a bridger. We need someone who know all about the feds and who have the contacts for the feds in the state and all of those great things, but they also are still very much connected to their community, and they have the ability to what my community call is code switch, right? I can be in this sector and identify in this sector, but I can also be in my community, and my community still understand me despite the fact that I live in two different worlds. And so I call it the bridger, or another term is a community navigator, someone who can be in the community and trickle that information down. And that position is actually funded not by the local team and local community and agencies, but the states and the feds, because they are the ones who need to get the information into the community. The community only needs to receive, right? And then get information. So my thought is we need a bridger. We need someone who's a navigator who understands both worlds, if that makes sense.
Could we do both? Change federal legislation and have a bridger. I mean, it's going to take time.
Well, and it's not just, if I can, Shada, I guess we're just jumping in, it's Irma. I think it's all of the above. It's not a this or that. It's this and that. And another thing I'm finding recently in Michigan is they've got a lot of new staff working this program, and they're learning too. And I think it could be an opportunity as they're learning to kind of co-create some new policies and guidelines. new definitions. So yeah, just hoping that we can throw that into the bag of solutions and tools to use. Thinking these are state employees, they're public servants, and we are the public. So there is some obligation, I think, to hear what we say and to see how what they're doing impacts the community and people they serve.
Thank you both. So I think this is a good lead into one of my next questions and following on some of the comments that Shaquana was making. And I just want to lift up the idea that I think a lot of the times when we talk about things about like around federal funding and specifically water infrastructure, there's a lot of emphasis on the technicality of the process, but this is at the same time highly relational work and has direct impact on communities, right? And so community involvement is essential and core to what the whole purpose of what we're doing here is. So my question for Shaquana is around whether or not you have you're aware of or have been involved with any good examples of that bridge being created, flow of federal funds to a local community and impacting workforce development, whether it's, so for example, I know a lot of GLRI funds have made it to St. Louis County. Was that a good example? Or in other issue areas, have there been good examples of this bridging community engagement, workforce development, et cetera?
Yes, I would say that the best example I have is an initiative that I have been a part of for the last 2 years. I feel like it's maybe been longer, but maybe it's because it was a lot of work. But anyway, so the initiative is the WEAS group. And because I never can remember acronyms, I'm going to get a piece of paper that actually has the acronym on it. But what the WEAS group focus on is putting people of color in position of power. And that is putting them in a position to help make decisions, to help guide the process. They are a part of the hiring or contracting with individuals. And then we created a very a multi-year action plan to address workforce concerns and economic development through entrepreneurship concerns. And what we did there is we have the community consultants who are BIPOC-led individuals or BIPOC individuals. And then we have agencies in the community such as Family Rise Together, such as Family Freedom Center, which are 2 Black-led nonprofit organizations. We've invited ACO and NAACP to the table, but then we also invited the individuals like Minnesota Workforce or Duluth Career Workforce, Project SOAR, those organizations who are the leaders in our community in the economic development world and the workforce world. And then we created partnerships and said, this is how we will move. We took our very first year, which was a planning year, merely getting to know each other. Because there is the concern of trust. There is the concern of, is this something that's already been done? And there's the question of how many times are we going to meet and not have something feasible in our hand that is something tangible that people can hold on to and not just an action plan, right? So I think that would be a really good example, putting power back into the hands of the BIPOC community and making them responsible for the flow of information into our community. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that is super helpful. Thank you, Shaquana. The next question I want to ask, I think, is maybe directed toward Nick, but I think, Shaquana, maybe you have some experience with this in terms of federal funds flowing, but how do SRF funds in particular flow to tribal nations? And are there intended use plans? And where do state rules and regulations apply or not? So any more detail about that process and how it may differ or be similar to the state process?
That's a good question. We haven't done that analysis. And so, yeah, unfortunately, I don't think I can answer it right now.
Cool. Okay. Good area for additional exploration.
Shada, just to jump in there, as I think the tribes do manage it internally differently, but the EPA does have a specific set aside from the total SRF investment annually for tribal work. So similar to a state allocation, the tribes have a separate allocation that goes towards that work. But I think that is a combined total that goes towards all tribal communities in the different tribes. But how they manage it from there on, I'm not 100% sure, but we at least know that there's that bucket of money that goes towards them from the SRF accounts.
Thank you for that, Alexis. Another question that we have here is, why can't there be certification of contractors and their skill sets and pools of certified contractors for emerging projects on state and community levels? Training programs and other skill sets programs, as Shaquana stated, the need for could be set up with sensitivity to equity, proportions, and job needs in an area. I don't know if that's been seen anywhere else, or other ways of addressing this issue of incorporating more of these groups into these roles. I don't know if either of our panelists have a response to that or something that you're familiar with.
I don't have a natural response. I have like a flippant response. So I'm just not gonna say anything because it's like the first thing that came to my mind. So what I will say is that I do love the idea of certified contractors and emerging projects. My concern is that there is this idea or ideology that there's not enough of the pie to go around. And so those in those positions that could actually be of service will feel threatened that they're really training in the people that's going to take over where they're at. And so how do you change? How do we deal with that? Right? Like, we need to acknowledge that that is a real concern, and a fair concern, because our country has been based on seniority for decades and decades. So I can see where mentorship and things of that nature would be good, but then we have to build relationships with those in those positions to come in and do that work.
Thank you for that, Shaquana. I'm not seeing any other questions coming in the chat. I don't know if folks are interested in coming off of mute and asking questions or other things that our panelists haven't been asked but may want to make sure that they share with our audience today.
I'm gonna put my computer on it.
Oh, yes. Annalisa, I see your hand is raised.
Thanks. Thank you so much for these presentations. This has been extremely informative. I had a question. As we're sort of thinking about the state revolving funds, we're looking at how different states have been successful in leveraging the funding that has come in. And I have not delved deep into sort of the financial mechanisms that allow some states to leverage SRF dollars to, whether it's through an unexpectedly or a high number of projects that have been able to be funded, or a certain, like successful in the sense of, utilizing those funds to generate more value. But I am kind of curious for folks on this call, if you know of good resources to help understand, how some states have been successful, whether, beyond just going to the bond market, and if there are maybe unintended consequences or considerations we should be thinking about, either in terms of how states quantify sort of value generated through SRF funded projects, or in terms of repayment mechanisms that we should be wary of or thinking about, and potentially having just disparate impacts on communities. And I know there's like a ton of like little questions embedded in what now feels like a very long one. But I'm just curious about, what resources folks may have.
And so are you particularly interested in resources looking at sort of like different states and sort of how they've answered those questions and trying to sort of do a compare and contrast kind of analysis?
Yeah, kind of. I mean, so I'm Annalisa with the Alliance for the Great Lakes, so I'm very much interested in the Great Lakes states. But I guess as I'm trying to understand the sort of the impact of SRF funding, I guess I'm just curious to understand, from others, what you've seen in terms of how successfully some states maybe have been able to leverage the funds that come in.
I'll only add, and then I'm sure other folks have perspectives, that we did a report with American Rivers in 2019, looking at sort of loans and grants programs in sort of the Great Lakes states that largely focused on SRF programs, and was where I pulled a lot of the content for this presentation. Obviously, the report has more details, so I'll share that in the chat.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other additions regarding resources toward this question, or questions for our panelists today? Hearing and seeing none, I just want to take a moment to thank our panelists for their lovely presentations today and the information that was shared. And thank you all for your questions and the good conversation. I hope this was useful. And I would like to encourage you all to continue to register for additional workshops this week with the HOW Coalition. So the next panel will be tomorrow, October 27th from 11 to 12:30 Eastern. And the title of that panel is Moving Forward Together, Reimagining the Environmental Movement. I think someone's gonna put the link in the chat. Be sure to register for that. And thank you. Bye everyone, take care.
Thank you.